Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on culture activation for your organization. You might be able to see appearing on the screen now words that may or may not reflect elements of your organization's mission statement, your purpose, your values, or other articulations of the culture that you have in your organization. Now, today, we're not going to be talking about how you come up with these, because today we're talking about how action is far more important than words. And we're going to do that by focusing on 5 key areas, which Angela is going to talk to you about in a moment. But before we do, I would like to introduce the Innovation Beehive and indeed introduce myself so you know who's talking to you. So my name is Joe Nagel. I'm Innovation Director with the Innovation Beehive. And we work with people teams, with senior leaders and with innovation teams in organizations to turbocharge their culture by applying the processes that we also apply to innovation in organizations. So, you know, if you think about your mobile phone, there's a process that goes into developing every app, every element of the hardware, and that process is very often design thinking, otherwise known as human-centered design. And we thought, well, if it's human-centered, why not apply that process to people challenges in organizations? And I think one of the biggest challenges organizations face is around their organization culture. And we've worked with a huge range of organizations to articulate their culture, to activate their culture, and to come up with ways to make it live and breathe and be sustainable in their organizations. And you can see some of those on the screen. And I'm delighted to be joined by Angela, who I will invite to introduce herself now.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela, for those who haven't met me before, and I'm the People and Innovation Director at the Innovation Beehive. My focus at IB is on 2 of the elements that you saw there, leadership and culture. And I'm very excited to be sharing our insights and our experiences today, because we've found, particularly over the last 12 months, that organizations' culture and leadership has been really tested. And some have seen just how kind of fragile they are, assumptions been challenged that they've made in the past. So yeah, really excited to share what we're going to share today. First of all, we've got a poll because we'd like to know how you see culture in your organization.
So that should have appeared on screen for you now.
Lovely. So we've got a list here. So it could be that in your organization, you've got clear values, you've got clear articulation of your culture, and it may or may not be coming to life. So I'm going to invite you now to just tick as many as apply to you in your organization.
And there's a mixed bag of responses here. So you might find that more than one applies. So feel free to select more than one. Be interesting to see if anyone chooses things that actually contrast, because there might be some elements of the organization where the values are really well defined and really well lived, and other areas where they're not so. But we can see responses coming in now. We'll give it a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to vote. I know a few people have just arrived. So for anyone who has just arrived, you should see a poll on your screen. We're just asking you to respond to the statements you see and select as many as apply to you and to your organization. Well, I think that's a fair amount of time for it to be up. So I'm going to close the poll and we'll share the results. Oh, actually, I spoke too soon. I just saw a flurry of activity coming in there. And if anyone thinks none of those apply to them, feel free to type into the chat box. And indeed, type anything that type into the chat box as we go, and we'll respond to the comments and questions as we go along. So let's end that poll and see what the results are.
Absolutely. What a mixture.
Appear on your screen now. That really is a mixture. And, you know, one of the ones that really sticks out for me there is every team has its own microculture. And that can apply in organizations that have a really clearly defined and articulated culture anyway, can't it, Angela? We've seen that in organizations we've worked with.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it works, but quite often it doesn't. That it's, again, it works for those individual teams until times get tested, until suddenly change happens, and then you realize that you know, it doesn't work across teams.
And one of the really positive ones that has come up quite strongly,
All
almost half the people who've responded have said that they've got written values and hear about these a lot from their leaders. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the webinar today, about the importance of hearing about the values and seeing the values from our leaders. So it's good to know that a lot of us on the call are on that journey already. And I'm actually pleased to see that, and I do feel for you, the one person who responded that your written values are gimmicky. That can be one of the big problems that comes from focusing purely on the words rather than on the actions that go alongside them. And we're gonna hopefully burst that apart today. And if you're stuck with those gimmicky values, hopefully you can find a way to make them live in the organization so that they're less gimmicky in the future, because they actually reflect reality. So Angela, why don't you tell us?
No one's values are perfectly capturing what it's like to work here, but I guess you wouldn't be here if they were. So.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah. That's a relief, because that's one of the outcomes we're hoping for from this call. So, Angela, over to you to tell us what we're going to be doing in the session today.
Lovely. Okay, so you know what you signed up for, but this is our sort of roadmap for today. We're just going to spend a few minutes talking about what is culture. Not too long, because as Joe said, this isn't about helping you define culture. This is about saying, how do you actually bring it to life, embed it in your organization? And we're going to focus on 5 areas to enable you to do that. And then at the end, we'd like to talk to you about the culture roadmap. So how do you actually get from one point to the next? How do you actually, you know, go on that journey of embedding your desired culture in your organization? First, I'm going to talk to you about bread and French bread laws. And you might be wondering why. Well, when as with most things I work with, I can Google in what is leadership, what is this, what is that, into the internet, and it comes up with all sorts of definitions. But this is my favorite on culture, and it's the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. I think that sums it up very nicely. So why am I talking to you about French bread laws? Well, when you think about France, part of their culture is food. It's something that's really important to them. They're really proud of their chefs, and they're really proud of their restaurants. It's, you know, it's a country that's really proud of its culinary prestige. And one of the most fundamental aspects of food is bread, and so much of their culture around bread, it stems from the French Revolution, when you know the French Revolution really gained momentum because people were starving. There just wasn't food, and yet you had this aristocracy who had as much as they wanted, and they vowed that no one will ever go without bread again. Now the French have very specific bread laws that you can only call yourself a boulangerie if you actually bake bread on the premises. There are strict ingredients about what must go in a baguette for you to call it a traditional baguette. And even in Paris, I don't know if you've ever been to Paris in August, but it's virtually empty because it's traditional for Parisians to go on holiday in August, and businesses will close, and it's, you know, it's very, very quiet city at that time of year. And the French, as part of their décret pain, their French bread laws, in Paris, bakers can only go on holiday at a certain time of year. So half of the bakers in Paris can go on holiday in July, and the other half go in August, and it alternates every year. And it's just amazing that they have strict rules about when a whole profession can go on holiday, but it all stems from there. No one will go without bread. And I've got to read you a quote from Dominique Caract, who's spokesperson from the Paris Chamber of Professional Bakers. Of course, Paris has a Chamber of Professional Bakers. And he says, we can't expect people to have to jump in a car and go in search of a loaf of bread. Like, heaven forbid that you can't just walk out of your apartment and go and buy your bread in the morning. And that's just such a part of their culture, that they have fresh bread, you know, for breakfast, and fresh bread every day. And to me, that sums up French culture brilliantly. It's just so, it's the antithesis of American culture, where they have a right to get in a car and drive to go and buy their loaf of bread. And the reason I'm sharing this is because culture isn't just something that as Joe's been saying, it's not just words on a page that we value food. It's saying, no, this is inherent. This is something we really believe in. It's true to us. And we will bring in laws about when people can go on holiday so that this comes to life. And this is what we want to share with you today, is all the different elements that you can bring to play to really bring your culture to life and make it live for you. Now, I've got something else for you to think about next. And I'm going to show you a lot of images on this screen. And what I want you to do is look at these and just go with your gut and just pick 1 or 2 cards that represent what does it feel like to work in your team. And then I also want you to think about what is the worst behavior that's allowed within your team? And I'll tell you why in a moment. So what does it feel to work like in your team? And what's the worst behavior that you ever see in your team or organization?
And I've just put an example in the chat box. So I've said, you know, for example, worst behavior, fireworks because it's okay to blow our top. Now, that's not actually true of our team at the Innovation Beehive, is it? It was the first image I saw. So yeah, do look at the images and either the behaviors in your team or the worst behavior, or what it's like to work in your team, or the worst behaviors that are allowed in your team. So type which one you're responding to, and then type the image and type why. And we'll share some of those. What would you pick for our team, Angela?
Well, it's funny because I was drawn to the fireworks. I don't know whether it's because it's in the middle and the most colourful, but because I was thinking I've had a lot to celebrate lately.
That's a much nicer way of looking at the fireworks. Okay, we've got some brilliant responses coming in. We've got the gift box and the cheetah. We go after the new and shiny and sometimes move too quickly. That's a really good response, actually. That's really interesting because it can be fun and exciting to find the new thing, but sometimes we aren't cheetahs. We're not the fastest animal in the world. So sometimes we do, as organizations, move too quickly, and either that means we leave people behind, or it means we fail without learning, those sorts of things. So got another one, the alligator. We have to tread carefully or we get snapped at. So that's an example of a worst behavior. Thank you.
Okay.
The timer, as everyone says, they're too busy and not enough time. That's interesting. And in some organizations, not having enough time or being too busy is almost regarded as a badge of honor. So there's kind of reinforcement of that in the iconic actions, which we're going to talk about later, or in the communication that comes from colleagues or from leaders. The hands, we do all try to work together and support each other. Very nice. That's great. Brilliant. So whether you've typed or not, hold on to your thoughts on that image. We're going to come back to them shortly. So I want to talk a little bit about what culture is and what culture can look like. And to do that, I'm going to share 2 models. The first model, the lily pond, which you can see on the screen here, was developed by Edgar Schein. And it paints a picture of organizational culture in terms of layers of visibility. You can see the lilies on top of the pond. You can see the beautiful lily pads and the flowers that emerge from them. We can see them. But as we go deeper under the water and then further down into the ground, we can't always see what is generating and what is sustaining the outward manifestation of our culture. And if we only focus on what can be seen, then we neglect the things that actually give structure and actually give nutrients to our organization's culture. So the most obvious manifestation of our lily pads, the surface level, is the words that we use. These are the cultural artifacts that we use to describe our organization's culture, our mission statement, our values, our purpose, the behaviors that we say we want our people to operate with. But in order to make these be sustainable, they need structure, they need cultural mindsets, they need emotional ground, they need behaviors, they need motivational roots. And what I'm sharing on the screen now is another model, and this comes from Johnson and Scholes, and it's called the culture web, and I've reformatted it slightly to combine it with the lily pond analogy from Edgar Schein. You can see that underneath the symbols that you can see visibly are the rituals and routines, are the control systems, the power structures, the organizational structures, all the laws that Angela was talking about in the context of French bread making. You know, the symbol is everyone deserves a loaf of bread. But actually, to make that happen, you need all of these structures, systems, routines, processes in place in order to achieve that end. And all of those together nurture and sustain and build the structure for the cultural mindset to thrive. And the final piece is around emotional ground. And one of the most powerful ways of building emotional ground and feeding and giving nutrients to the whole cultural structure is by telling stories, not made up stories, but real stories. And by getting people to share their stories across the organization, by getting leaders to share stories to bring your culture to life, by getting people to share stories with each other to bring that culture to life. And that constantly reinforces and feeds the rest of the cultural structure. So, as we explore the 5 areas of focus that Angela briefly introduced when she was sharing what we're going to cover today, it's worth thinking about, particularly thinking about the culture web, because the culture web kind of covers the surface level, the structure, and the emotional ground that feeds the whole culture. And you can see on this slide that actually all of the 5 elements that we're going to be covering today use different elements of the culture web. And the culture web really is a web. It envelopes and encompasses all of the 5 areas of activation that we're going to be talking about today. And this moves so far beyond just having words on a PowerPoint deck or words in a job description or words on a wall. So Angela, I think we're going to do one more look at the picture analogy, the picture activity that we just discussed. And what I want you to think about when you think about the pictures that you chose earlier, and think about the behaviors and think about the way it felt, I want you to think about the culture web. Think about these aspects, these elements: control systems, power structures, organization structures, routines, symbols, and stories. Think about these in the context of the behaviors and the way it feels and the mindset that you identified when you were looking at these pictures. Reflect on those and reflect on how the structures and processes that are in place in your organization either enable, encourage, enforce, or hold back the kind of behaviors and the kind of way of feeling that you want in your organization and in your team. Because all of those things in the culture web all feed into the experience that you have on a day-to-day basis in your organization. And that's something to do after the call today. Think about those 6 areas of the culture web and think about how you can maybe adjust some of them or support your leaders to adjust some of them so that you actually get the desired behaviors that you want. And we're going to talk about 5 areas of focus today that you can use to actually start to move the lever on those 6 areas of the culture web. So Angela, over to you for leadership.
Thank you. Well, we'll start with leadership, and for each of the 5 elements, I want to talk about, you know, what happens when you don't get it right. You know, that'll tell us why we're doing this in the first place, and you will probably relate to a lot of what I'm talking about, not necessarily in the team you're in at the moment, but where you've worked in the past, and you will have seen elements of this all. Now, I'm starting with leadership because, to be honest, if you do nothing else, you've got to have leadership commitment to the culture, because if you don't, then the whole culture just loses credibility. I mean, just think about the hoo-ha, and that will be my biggest understatement of the day, when Dominic Cummings drove to Durham and then went to test his eyesight at Barnum Castle on his wife's birthday. You know, whether you agree with what he did or not, the leadership then just lost credibility. That a lot of behavior changed after that. And I'm sure we've all seen it, where leaders say one thing but do another. It's do what I say, not what I do. You're just not going to get the buy-in if the leadership aren't living the culture that they say is important. And it builds mistrust, not just in the leadership, but actually across teams, because some teams will say, well, we're doing it, but you're not. And it just builds mistrust and resentment right across the teams. And again, you can probably relate to this. So let's not focus on the negatives. What can we do to get it right in terms of leadership and culture? Well, it's so important that leadership actually really demonstrates that culture matters. I was talking to some members of an exec recently, and they're saying, well, this is how we behave within the exec, and we bring the values to life. But the thing is, people don't get to be flies on the wall in those meetings. It actually has to be, you have to be seen to be bringing the values to life. It's not good enough to just say, well, I'm secretly doing it. It's got to be something that that leadership actually actively promotes, because it is so important, because your culture will happen whether you manage it or not. So how you manage it is so important to creating the culture that you really want. So so demonstrating that culture matters, is it on board agendas? We support leaders in how to share it at town halls, at all hands meetings. And one of the key things is actually in them role modeling the behaviours individually and as a collective. And again, we encourage leaders to admit when they're finding them tricky, that they're saying, yeah, I'm learning as well, in order to demonstrate this value or these behaviours, and this is how I'm learning how to do it. And again, this is part of the storytelling that Joe talked about, was sharing stories like that says none of us are perfect, we won't get it right first time, and it's not something that we've done culture. It's something that is ongoing, and the culture will keep being tested, but we're going to keep learning and keep being better than we were before to bring this culture to life. So absolutely role modeling behaviors. And then something we call iconic actions, which again is something just very visible, very everyday, that everyone can go, ah, yes, that really talks about our culture in the organization. And have you got some examples you want to share, Joe?
Yeah, I've actually got a great example of an iconic action. And one of the points about iconic actions is that they are intentional. So the reason for doing what you do is to demonstrate, to role model a particular aspect or all aspects of your culture. And there's one great example of that from one of our clients. One of their values, and it had underlying behaviors, was around innovation, and one of the behaviors was around celebrating failure. And they decided they would put a structure in place to celebrate this, to encourage celebration of failure. They launched a sort of biannual failure competition. You could nominate yourself for a failure that you had experienced or that you had done, and you could then share the learning, and there would be a prize of some value, as well as recognition in the organization to mark your success at failing, as it were. So they launched it with big fanfare. It was put out to the organization, and they sat waiting for responses to come in. And they didn't get a single response to the first run of this competition, because nothing had been done to actually lay the groundwork for it. They thought this was the groundwork they were laying for their culture, but nothing happened. No one submitted a nomination of themselves, and they certainly weren't going to submit nomination of anyone else. So they thought, okay, well, this is a failure. We haven't succeeded here. But rather than saying, okay, we're just going to mothball this and recognize that it didn't work, they thought, well, what can we do? So one of their senior leaders decided to stand up at an all hands meeting and nominate himself for his failure, for a failure that he had succeeded in achieving, as it were, because of course this is a competition for failure. And he didn't sugarcoat the failure. It wasn't like it wasn't like in a TED talk where you get presented with a perfect narrative of success, then failure, then success, and here I am telling you about it. It was just, actually, this went wrong, and here's what I learned, and I wasn't actually able to put it right because it just went wrong. And he did that, and then at the end of it, he said, and we got this competition for others to share their failure, and it would be lovely if people got involved when we launch it in a couple of weeks. And people did, because they had seen one of their senior leaders who they respected standing up and talking about his failure and talking about what went wrong without sugarcoating. So then they had a great success in the next round, and this competition has been running ever since. So that's an example of role modeling the desired behaviors in a visible way to show that the culture matters. And it's an example of an iconic action that a leader can take to signal the kind of behaviors that they're looking for in their organizations. And I'm just conscious actually that a lot of you said that you've seen your leaders succeeding in delivering the values, or talking about and communicating the values. So just as we talk through the next point, which is around engagement, it would be lovely to get some comments, if we can, of what you've seen in your organization or what you've seen in other organizations of leaders role modeling, communicating, doing iconic actions and visibly demonstrating the values. Feel free to comment and we'll come back to those after the next section.
That'll be interesting, Joe, because the statement was about leaders talk about them. So it'd be interesting to know whether they did bring them to life.
Yeah.
And Julie's put in the chat about what do you do when people are sabotaging or being underhand about the. So it's apt that we're coming to engagement right now, because one thing I will say about the leadership is it does have to be unified. If you've got one sabotaging it, and I've worked in organizations where this has happened, it really discredits the whole thing. So yes, you've got to have every single leader throughout the organization really behind these values, and it's worth investing time in doing that and finding out what their personal objections are to it. But I think Julia's question might have been about not just about leadership, but about everybody. You do have people throughout an organization who will question the values, question the culture. There's something about it that they don't quite like. And this is part of the disconnect, actually, is, you might have defined your culture, you've identified your core values, you've got your leadership on board, but there's still some people who just don't feel connected to it. And so how you communicate these values out is so important, because some organizations just produce them and then they're in the annual report, or they're on the website, and that's it. And then, but we're talking about very sort of nebulous statements. It's like I said, I Google what is leadership from time to time just to see what people are saying new about it. There's so many ways of interpreting things like honesty, openness, integrity, trust, and they mean different things to different people. So that engaging people in the right way to say, this is what we mean by it, this is why it's important, is so important to get the buy-in, and to make sure people really do connect with the values. So how do you do that? Well, we always say build alignment right from the start. So when we go into organization as part of the culture audit, we'll be finding out, right, what's going on at the moment, what does the new culture need to address, and sometimes it's not a huge change that needs to happen, but there's always something that we need to know what's working really well and what needs to change. And alignment is so important right at the beginning. So we talk to people right across the organization, different levels, different departments, and remember, we're trying to sort of condense something down so it's meaningful for everyone. And it's a tricky thing to do, but once people know that they've had a chance to express how they feel about it, what they want to see different, and so on, you just get so much more buy-in. And what's produced is we test it, we test our assumptions, we prototype and make sure it works, and most importantly, getting the language right so it resonates with people. So it's not management speak, it's not the CEO's favorite word, it's actually this is what the staff want, who are actually going to be using these values and living these values. Now, unless you're in a position to actually start again and you've already got your values, there are still so many ways you can bring it to life, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what I'll say is it's so important that that the values are understood by everyone, so making them as clear and simple as possible. So we recommend a maximum of 4, Again, I've seen in some organizations they'll have 10 or 12, and sometimes it's kind of just too much. It's not supposed to be a comprehensive list of all the good things you should do. It's not, it's guidance to say, look, if we behave in this way and make this happen, this is what will support us to achieve our purpose, to achieve our objectives as an organization. And we also say be explicit about behaviors. So don't just say, right, we're going to have integrity, honesty, and trust, and they'll be our values. You actually got to say, look, okay, what does that mean for us in this organization? So in one organization, trust might mean we've got to keep everything confidential because that's what our clients, our customers want. In another one, it might be we share everything openly because we trust each other. So all the information is shared. In another, trust might be, I trust you to do what you need to do because I'm part of the supply chain, and it's very important that we trust each other to do our own jobs. So again, what does it mean for that organization? And then, as I say, even if you can't start from the beginning and say, right, what are our values, what is and articulate the culture, is you can provide space for your team to really explore and interpret, what does the purpose mean, what do the values mean, what do the culture mean for us. So it might be that you have risk taking as one of your values, but you work in a legal department. Now, there's only so much risk that you should take in a legal department. But it's not to say you can't try new things. It's kind of, right, what does that actually mean for us? How can we support the organization better, do our jobs better by taking this value and translating what it means for us? And that doesn't necessarily create microcultures like we talked about before. What it means is, right, we've got these values, but actually for us, it looks slightly different than it does for the product development department or the sales department or so on. Does that make sense, Joe?
It certainly does. It certainly does. And I think one of the overarching points to make when it comes to engagement is, you've got your simple, clear, memorable statements of your values. You've built alignment from the start. You've been explicit about the behaviors. And I think one of the key things is then to be clear on how you're going to communicate these and develop a communication plan that actually enables people to engage. So it's really important that it's somehow or other you create a two-way communication mechanism. And one of the best two-way communication mechanisms that we have developed with our clients is what we call culture ambassador programs. So culture ambassadors are a group from across the business, a real cross-section from the organization, both in terms of seniority and also in terms of function, who come together to receive some training perhaps, or some workshops on the culture, so that they've got a deep understanding of the culture. And then they go out and they are like the image that you can just about see on the screen here. They are the sort of dandelion seeds going out and sharing that culture across the organization. But there's so much more than just dandelion seeds, because this is two-way, because not only do they share the culture across the organization, but they are also an earpiece to the organization for senior leaders, for the people team, for the HR team, whoever is responsible for culture in the organization, and then regularly come back and share their insights into what's going on, to share the lay of the land. So, your organization is constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly growing. Culture ambassadors are there to hear and understand what's going on the ground. They're also involved often in induction, so they'll come in and do the culture induction piece for new starters. And one of the nice things about that, again, is that it means that often culture can be quite stale in an induction. It's like, here's a PowerPoint with some values on it. But actually, if you've got a culture ambassador who can share their stories of how the culture has come to life for them, then it's kind of peer-to-peer, it's real, it's human and authentic. And actually, when you think about what a culture is, it's the way we work together here. So it's good to hear how it works in the organization. So
I was going to just answering the question that was asked about why do certain people use underhand tactics to attack. Culture ambassadors can be a great way of talking to people one-to-one. So they understand, where did the values come from? Why is it important? What is it hoping to achieve? sharing, again, they can share stories one-to-one. And if people still aren't engaged, sometimes it's not about the culture, actually, it's about something else.
Exactly.
So it's important that culture ambassadors have good coaching skills, good questioning and listening skills, because actually they need to know what they're tackling.
Absolutely. And in terms of almost a job description for culture ambassadors, if you like, it's worth saying what they're not. You know, there's been a few organizations we've worked with where culture ambassadors have become almost like a social committee. And you know, organizing events, organizing social events and get-togethers. Now, it might be that if your culture is very much geared towards that kind of thing, then that's what your culture ambassadors need to be. But what we tend to find is that actually the role of the culture ambassador might cover things like, you know, running sessions in their team meetings that dial up the culture that they get a facilitator's guide for. It might be holding drop-ins for people to just drop in and chat to them about what the culture is like for them at the moment. It might be that they support inductions, as I said. They could run surveys, just like, you know, in between pulse surveys, in between employee engagement surveys, purely focused on culture. And also, crucially, having a voice at the senior level so that they can share their insights, so that the senior leaders are actually patched into what's going on in the organization. And that's a nice segue to just go back to what we were talking about earlier around leaders. We've had some brilliant examples of what leaders are up to in their organizations. So Stacey said that leaders talk about the culture in company meetings and also take part in activities around the culture. That's really important. Again, role modeling, iconic actions, and also good communication. Rachel has said that actually their values were crowdsourced from the organization and the words came directly from employees. So that's a really great way of building engagement because you've kind of built alignment from the start. And also senior leaders using vlogs and conversation opportunities to share their stories. So that's brilliant. Again, you know, leaders there looking at the whole spectrum of the culture web. You know, you've looked at how you're going to come up with the value statements, but then also thinking about how you build and sustain that emotional connection through conversation opportunities and sharing stories. Fantastic.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, capability. Now, this is just one area that's so important and yet just often doesn't even get a look in. So a lot of organizations, they'll articulate their culture, they'll share it out, they'll do the engagement, and critically in that engagement, say, how will we challenge each other if we're not living this? And so it gets real momentum. But then sometimes people actually aren't equipped to live the values that they're being asked to live. So I was talking to a client once who said, oh, we worked in an organization where he was told, we've got to all be more entrepreneurial. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Oh, well, we need to be more agile and make decisions faster and take more risks. It's kind of, right, okay, but we don't know how to do that because we've been, we're an organization that's 200 years old in a very sort of established industry. You can't suddenly expect that to happen without giving people the tools and techniques for doing that. And very importantly, giving leaders and team managers the skills to be able to create the environment where that's okay. So sometimes, you know, as I say, the engagement's great, and it gets a real boost, gets some momentum, the fireworks are going off, but then nothing else happens. It all goes quiet because people just don't know how to do it. So either your culture is just not happening, or it's just not happening well, and people just get frustrated because they want to be on board, but you're not giving me support to make that happen. So just feel resentful. Okay, so how do you make it happen? Well, it's the classic: identify what you need, do a gap analysis, and fill the gap. So identify the capabilities. So what does the organization need? So if it says, right, one of our values is now inclusion, it might be actually you need to get a specialist in it to help you. It may be that you need to hire someone on an interim basis to help you kind of really get that value established. More often though, it's the team and the individuals that need to explore, right, how do we build capability in this area? So we're suddenly told we need to be entrepreneurial or innovative. Right, what does that mean for us? Right, how can we be that? How can we do that? And so we need to do a gap analysis about what are we doing already that meets that value, and what are we less confident in? Is it just that we don't do it and we actually have got the capability, we just need to do it more? Or is it that we really need some support, some real development in order to do that? And a lot of the insights can come from customers, from employee surveys, from performance reviews, appraisals, whatever you call them. Quite often, people will be honest with themselves and say, yes, I need this development. Or we often just put a program together and people self-select to go on it. And that way people, it's safe for people to say, well, I just want to go on that program, even though I think I'm quite good anyway. People will still come on the training. But what we'd also say is filling the gap isn't just about workshops. You know, teams can work together and say, is one of us expert in this, or how can we develop this? How can we develop this together to do this? How can we make connections across the organization to tap into other people who are doing this and share our stories and share our expertise? So again, it's not a tick box exercise. It's not saying, right, we're capable at this now. It's how do you make it so that people can really enjoy bringing this culture to life and make it fun. They own this culture now. They want it to be successful. So how can you make it fun and creative for them to do that?
Exactly. And I think there's a really good point there, that it's not just about a training workshop. It's not just about, a one-off intervention and then saying, right, we've done it. It's about making it systemic and sustainable for the long term. And there's a brilliant example from one of our clients. They're a quick service restaurant chain. A few years ago, they came to us asking for some customer service training. And we agreed with them that we would use human-centered design to work out exactly what they needed, identify capabilities, perform a gap analysis, and fill the gap. And the one thing that they didn't need was another process. They didn't need another training program that taught people how to do things in a particular way. So they didn't need, a conversation tree that said, if the customer says this, then do this. If the customer says that, then do that. What they actually needed was a culture shift in each of their restaurants, because what we identified was that in order to genuinely feel that you can take care of your customer, you need to feel taken care of in your restaurant by your colleagues, by your manager, by the business. So instead of customer service training, what we actually delivered was culture conversations right across the estate, right across the UK. And what these looked like was a conversation which focused both on the customer, but also on colleagues. And it was all centered around taking care of each other. And through that conversation, we weaved in the value statements, we weaved in the core behaviors that were expected of people in the organization, but got people to see that actually they had this within themselves already. It wasn't an external person with a PowerPoint telling them how they should be. They were uncovering that actually they know what it's like to be a customer, so they know how customers want to be treated. They know what it's like to be a member of the team, so they know how the team wants to be treated. So it was very much based on this idea of treating others as you would like to be treated. And it was delivered initially by us, and then we trained effectively a group of culture ambassadors across the estate to deliver it themselves. And that gets rerun in restaurants, so up and down the country, right to this day. We started the process about 4 years ago, and they're still using it. It's still showing success now. So new people being inducted go through a mini version of this conversation, and regularly it's run for the whole restaurant to reinforce it. Now, the key thing as well on that is that we didn't actually run it with everyone in the organization. That wasn't necessary, because what you find with culture interventions is once you reach a critical mass, and the percentage, I'm not going to give you a percentage, it varies from organization to organization, depending on your other structures that you have in place. But once a certain number of people in the organization have the capability that you're looking to embed, then through a sort of osmosis, it permeates out to everybody else, and the behaviors that you're seeing will change, and you'll see improvements in the metrics that matter to your strategy. So it's a great example of how to build capability thinking outside the box rather than just focusing on training.
Thanks, Joe. And it's a good example as well, is where it's about creating the environment where these values can really come to life, where you can really create the culture that you want to create. And part of that is the engagement and the capability, and part of it is getting developing the leadership capability to help create that environment where it's psychologically safe to start being a bit different, because that's what you're asking people to do when you're changing culture, is behave slightly differently or very differently, and it's creating the safe space for people to be able to do that. Now, another enabler is the people processes. In fact, it's all your processes, but our focus is on the touch points for employees. So what's the employee journey like? Well, again, when you don't get it right, you're training in the wrong things. Your focus is not on the right things. You're recruiting people who aren't a cultural fit in your organization. Time and money is wasted. You might be losing potential because your systems are actually slowing people down. And you're not recruiting the people who do fit in your organization. And all that incongruence just leads to people just being confused, that I thought we were about this and suddenly we're not, and disengagement. Whereas actually, when you get it right, it really helps to embed the culture that you really want. So if you take something like recruitment, when you say your core value is fun or innovation, but your system is really for applying is really laborious. So this happened to me about 10 plus years ago. I saw this job well before Innovation Beehive. I saw this job that said it wanted a learning development manager who would bring really creative ideas, who was innovative and so on. And I thought, oh, the job description looked great. So I went online to start applying. And like 40 minutes later, I'm still on page 3 of filling this awful form in. And I thought, you don't want people who are innovative. You don't want creativity. And then I thought, oh, maybe this is a challenge. So I then stopped it and then applied a different way. And they said, no, we want you to go, you have to go through this. And it was for a financial organization. And I just thought, yeah, that's not the culture for me. You say you want one thing, but actually you don't. And again, was it that their values were misaligned to actually what their culture was, or was it the process that was misaligned? I'll never find out. But the important thing is, do your policies and processes, all of them that touch on people, whether it's customers or employees, do they support your values and your culture? So it's looking at them one at a time and saying, yes, do they align? And this can take a while. So let people know that it's happening, because people will put up with it if they know, yes, we're going to review recruitment, performance management, our reward policy, and so on. If they know it's being looked at, then they'll use their patience and say, yeah, that's fine. This is an ongoing thing. This is important. We want to do it properly. And very importantly, going back to the culture map, is what symbols, what stories can you incorporate in your people processes to really bring this to life? So have you got success stories of people or projects where these values have really added value to the organization or to a team? So incorporate those in there as well.
And that's a really important point there, because that also brings in the emotional connection that is talked about in the lily pad. So already, before people have even joined the organization, you're connecting with them at the deepest level, at the roots, so that when they do join the organization, they're ready to nurture and develop the structure. And ultimately, the visible manifestation will be people who are aligned to the culture. So there's a great example from one of our clients of really focusing on your people processes to bring them in line with your culture. And we worked with this company who, one of their values is to be audacious. That's a big word, and it's quite an exciting word that would get you excited. But as Angela just mentioned, when she went for that job that was you know, an exciting sounding job, but then three plus pages of application form before you even get into the detail is not exciting. So they wanted to reimagine their induction process. So when people join the organization, how can we make our induction process more exciting and more engaging and more audacious? So to do that, we applied, again, human-centered design thinking. We applied that with the organization, co-creating a smorgasbord of potential solutions and really audacious and vibrant ideas that would transform the organization's induction program. But also, this is a global organization, so there was a mindfulness that this needs to be kind of globally relevant, which means a bit of globalization. So by giving people in each region a range of ideas to choose from, they were then able to select the ones that would best meet the needs of their market. And that's a really useful point to consider if you're a larger organization, is how can we adapt our processes within our culture. So our culture is unified across the globe, or across our different markets, across our offices, across our regions. But actually, how can we adapt our processes so that the culture can thrive in context? Again, not micro cultures that are toxic and negative, but just adapting the culture to meet the regional needs. So really great example there, I think, of how you can take your values, and not only did they come up with ideas that would, you know, embed audacity into their people processes, but the process by which they adapted their people processes was also audacious. You know, it had never been done before. It was something new, innovative, and exciting. So yeah, great example, I think, of people processes.
A great project to work on as well. How do we make it audacious? It's a lot of fun. Okay, so again, the fifth area we want to focus on is actually measuring your culture. It's one thing that organizations say this is really important, but then they don't measure it, or they just do the odd pulse survey. Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just amazes me that that it doesn't get measured. And often because people say, well, it's too hard to measure it. Well, we'll challenge that because we find ways of measuring it. So if you don't measure it, you don't know what difference it's making. It could be that you didn't define what difference you wanted it to make in the first place. It could be that it was originally developed to address a particular issue, like you weren't attracting the right sort of talent, or you would change strategy and the culture needs to change with it. Is that still the difference that you want it to make? And if you don't know that, you don't know what to measure. So what it does is it just allows for complete mediocrity, inconsistency, because it will just happen. I've said it once and I'll keep saying it, is culture will just happen if you're not managing it. So, so manage it intelligently, work out from the beginning, what difference do we want our culture to make? And from that will inform you, what do we want to measure, and take a strategic approach to it. So the culture is there to support your purpose and your aims as an organization. So what are the steps that it does to do that? What are the intermediate things that it impacts on in order to support that to happen? And there'll be some things you're doing already that you can adapt. So your pulse surveys, looking at usual HR measures like attrition rates and so on. But also what's the impact on your customer, your client, your end game, because your culture will be making an impact. People will be looking at you, whether they want to apply to you, whether they want to shop with you, whether they want to use you, whether they're just reading about you in the press, and will be taking a view on what your culture is. So have a look what's happening on social media sites. What do people say about you on Glassdoor? And to me, and maybe because my focus is always on leadership, is one of the key measures is 360-degree feedback with your leadership, because they're the ones who will make the biggest difference. They're the ones who will create the environment for your culture to come to life. And the support needs to be there to help all your leaders to do that right through the organization, because they will then support teams in order to bring that to life. Anything to add on that, Joe?
Yeah, actually, I think I'd love to give an example to bring to life that idea of taking a strategic impact approach and using lots of different data points to really make sense of of what your culture is doing and what impact it's having. So again, this is the same company that we worked with to develop that conversation around taking care and having a customer orientated culture. What do you measure to have impact there? What do you measure to understand the impact? Well, obviously you measure customer satisfaction scores, right? Absolutely, you do that. But also you measure employee retention rates, because actually if your employees are feeling better taken care of, and you know that employees who feel better taken care of are more likely to take care of customers, then measuring retention rates is really valuable, because that ultimately adds value to your customer at the end of it. So you can also measure sales, because customers who feel more taken care of are more likely to come back. They're more likely to spend more in restaurants. So you can measure sales. You can also measure the direct impact that you had as a result of the session. So, you know, who doesn't like a happy sheet at the end of a facilitated session, you know? So you can measure those, and that is useful because it helps you to see if there's any immediate changes you need to make. And absolutely, you can measure feedback through pulse surveys, through annual employee engagement surveys. You can measure people's response to their line managers. And we did all of this with that client, and we created a strategic impact approach to measuring the impact of the intervention that we did to further their customer orientated culture. And ultimately, what this enables you to do is tell a story of the data that you've gathered. So there's two words that I love and never put on slides because I can never work out how to spell them. There's qualitative and quantitative. And I'm not even sure if I say them right, to be honest, but there you go. And what a strategic impact approach enables you to do is take the qualitative, so take the things people say, and take the data, the numbers that you can gather, and combine them, and then create a narrative which is grounded in fact as well as opinion. And in doing that, you create a really compelling story to show the success that you've measured, to show the impact of your culture. And this can be really useful for getting buy-in from your senior leaders, from your executive board, from your board of trustees, whoever your stakeholders are at a senior level who are looking at your investment in culture and saying, well, was that worth it? You can say, yes, it was, because we can tell you this story, which is grounded in fact. So we've looked at...
Beautifully brings us back to the leadership of saying, make it visible. This is what you have on your leadership agenda, on your board meetings, is what are you measuring in terms of culture and what impacts it having? So there's no excuse not to have it on your board meeting agendas.
Thank you. Absolutely. So we've highlighted these 5 key areas of focus: leadership, engagement, capability, people, processes, and measurement. And this is the roadmap that Angela referenced earlier, the roadmap to culture transformation. You can see that it starts with a diagnosis, an analysis of your existing culture, and then the creation of a direction and a compelling story. Now, that bit there is really important. That's where the words come in to a large extent. That by the end of those first 2 points, those first 2 steps on the roadmap, you'll have your vision, your values, your mission, your behaviors. Done. That's the words. Now, look, there's 2/3 of the roadmap left, and this is why this webinar is called More Than Words, because when you move into role modeling, communicating and creating support mechanisms, building the capability of your people, then you can see where the 5 areas of focus that we've identified in this webinar today really come into play. You know, leadership sits across the whole roadmap, engagement sits across those 4 areas in the middle, capability comes in when you start role modeling behaviors and communicating and building capability, and then the people processes come in when you need to build support mechanisms and measure and build capability. And you'll notice that measure starts at the beginning and comes back again at the end. And this comes back to what Angela said about the importance of understanding what it is you're going to measure in order to identify your success. And just one more really useful tool that you can use is what we call a from-to matrix. So this is where you get the organization to sort of identify how they feel about the culture now. And then once you've done your culture interventions, once you feel you've activated your culture, you can ask them again. And then you can ask them again in 6 months' time or 3 months' time. You can keep asking those questions about how people are feeling about the culture, because that way you're keeping your finger on the pulse of the organization. So there you have it, the roadmap to culture transformation, the 5 key areas of focus that will enable you to build your culture web and build a sustainable organizational culture in your organization, and ultimately turbocharge your culture for the future. Now, I'm offering you a free hour of my time So what I can do for you is take you through this in a bit more detail. We can explore options and opportunities for you to take action on leadership, engagement, capability, people, processes, and measurement. We can look at the innovation, look at the culture roadmap that I just shared on that slide, and we can find where you sit on it at this moment in this time. All you need to do, take your mobile phone, scan the QR code that's on the screen right now, and book a slot in my diary. It'll be for 60 minutes, completely free, chance to really explore your culture. If you're a decision maker when it comes to culture, then that's a great place to start. If you're not, it would still be great to talk to you, because you can always make a difference to your culture wherever you sit in the organization. And I can see Angela has put the link. If you don't have a QR code reader or you don't have a camera phone, Angela's put the link in the chat box. So please do feel free to reach out, book a slot in my diary, and it'll be great to chat more about your organization's culture. But Angela, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and thanks everyone for joining and for taking part in the activities we were running.
Thanks, everyone.